It's that time again, Our Town Live, where friends, family, people you know, and others you'd rather not know share with us their unique bits of wisdom. And now, here's Herb, your host, for another show.
Today, I'm talking about human trafficking and modern slavery. My guest, Nancy Hartwell, an American author who has written extensively on human trafficking. Nancy first became fascinated with this topic several years ago while living in Cameroon for 14 years. She was prompted to write the book when an acquaintance of hers, a German woman in her early 20s, mysteriously disappeared. It was later revealed that she was sold into the sex trade in the Persian Gulf, never to be seen again. Nancy has been collecting stories on human trafficking, turning them into 3 books, 2 fiction and 1 nonfiction. She has also examined the various aspects of human trafficking in the modern world. In this episode, we will discuss human trafficking, the slave trade. It's happening right under our noses. How does it still happen, even if it's against the law? Who are its likely victims? What do the slaves really do here? What can ordinary people do to stop this horrible practice? Now, here's my guest, Nancy Hartwell. Your specialty right now, or your main interest, or your books and things that you've been writing about, have been about human trafficking. Tell me exactly what that means.
Okay, well, this is when somebody steals another person and then makes them do things that normally they would not voluntarily do and not pay them for it. But they are under extreme duress, psychologically, physically, financially, and then are obliged to comply.
What is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling?
Okay, smuggling is when people illegally take people from one place to another. For example, people trying to smuggle people across the border. That is smuggling. But human trafficking does not necessarily involve transportation, although it often does.
Who would be vulnerable to becoming a victim of domestic or international human trafficking?
Okay, well, that's a pretty big question. Young people are especially at risk, and runaways have a target on them the size of Texas. There are predators lurking in bus stations, train stations, public parks, looking for people who look like they might be runaways. And they know all the buttons to push to get these young people to trust them. And then after a few days, they say, okay, sweetie, now you owe me big time. But mostly it's young people who are at risk. Young men for labor slavery. For example, the World Cup facilities that will host the World Cup finals in 2022 are in Qatar on the Persian Gulf. These facilities are already under construction and they are being built by slave labor. Recruiters go to nearby poor countries where it's hard to find a job, offer a fabulous job. The young guys sign what looks like a perfectly legitimate labor contract. Then they pay for their transportation to Qatar. When they get there, they confiscate their passports, make the guys work 18-hour days under 130-degree heat. They have been averaging a death a day, and nobody knows.
Do they do?
Young women, of course, are at risk for sexual trafficking. Labor trafficking is actually much more prevalent, but it's more fun to talk about sex slavery, so that gets a little bit more press.
on the labor side, what are we talking about as far as money for the people that are doing this? Is it very profitable?
It's very profitable. If you don't have very much labor costs, if your labor costs involve just sending a recruiter somewhere and paying airline tickets for somebody to come to work for you, and then you don't have to pay salaries, you don't have to pay benefits. It It's very lucrative. By the way, a pretty young blonde can retail easily for more than $100,000 on the Persian Gulf.
Oh, my.
10, that's $1 million. And as long as somebody's going to pay those prices, somebody is going to supply the market.
Back to the labor. As far as the labor, who perpetuates the kidnapping or the smuggling? Do the contractors? Do the people that use them for building, or are there middlemen or both?
Both. In Southeast Asia, the fishing industry is heavily dependent on slave labor. If you have frozen seafood in your freezer from Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, or Indonesia, there's about an 80% chance that it involves slave labor. And it's exactly the same technique. They go to Cambodia or Laos, offer fabulous jobs, and then the guys get there and they're betrayed. And if they don't perform up to snuff, they just dump them overboard.
My. How would somebody recognize a victim? Are there any telltale signs that I could see somebody and know that there's an issue?
Well, there are a few. It's hard because they're usually so spooked they don't want to talk to anybody. But remember that guy in Cleveland a couple of years ago who managed to keep 3 women locked up for 10 years?
Oh, right next door. Yes, right.
Yeah, right in plain view.
Mm-hmm.
And, okay, if you see locks outside, that's to keep somebody in. It's not to keep bad guys out.
Wow.
Somebody who is dressed very inappropriately for the weather. If it's 40 degrees and they're just wearing a sweater, you might want to just take note. Don't try to investigate yourself because these are not nice people, but take pictures if you possibly can. Note down time, date, etc., and then turn the information over to the authorities.
Where would I find a victim who has been trafficked for sexual exploitation? I live in Atlanta. Are there any places that people like this congregate?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's in almost every big city, there's a red light district or a place that if you drive by real slow, you can pick up a prostitute. About 99% of prostitutes are not there voluntarily. And they're controlled by a pimp who demands $300, $500, even $1,000 a day minimum quota. And if she doesn't bring him that $500 a day, she gets beaten to a pulp in front of all the other girls that he controls. Some of them are even physically branded, and I'm talking a hot iron branded. They have been betrayed, deceived, lied to, exploited so many times that they hardly even trust the people who are generally trying to help them. I used to work with a shelter in Baltimore that rescued girls from the streets. And it was very, very hard to help them because they didn't trust anybody. This shelter tried to give them their high school education because most of them dropped out when they were 13 or 14, give them marketable skills, and give them a comfortable, safe place to live. But even so, a few of them were so traumatized that, as strange as it may sound, they actually went back to the streets because, in a grotesque way, it was all that was familiar to them.
I know we talk a lot about sexual exploitation. We don't talk a lot about the laborers, the men. And I realize it's not sexy and it's not something to talk about. What is the percentage of those in relation to the sexual exploitation?
Well, of course, exact figures are real hard to come by because the predators don't turn in monthly reports to the Department of Labor.
Right. Sure.
So I would say probably 65-35%. labor against the sex trafficking. And there are some of them right here in the United States, mostly in agriculture, massage parlors, and nail salons. The Chinese and Vietnamese are very, very, very well organized for these massage parlors and nail salons. They have some people who are specialized in getting business licenses to make it appear like this is a perfectly legitimate, normal business that belongs right between the ice cream parlor and the barbershop. They have other people specialized in, quote, recruiting. Other people specialized in breaking the places down. If they hear there's going to be a police raid, they can break it down in about 45 minutes, and then they just move to the next county.
Without getting political, would you say that the caravan issue that we're in now would be a way for these people to come into the country?
The problem is that when they come to the country, then there are these, quote, coyotes who promise to take them across the Arizona desert to a safe place, okay?
Mm-hmm.
These coyotes, most of them are crooks. They charge a lot of money to these people, and then they take them straight to a slave labor camp where they are kept behind tall fences. They don't have the slightest idea of where they are. They wouldn't even know where to run if they could get away, and they can't. And so then they're stuck picking strawberries or whatever for free, of course. And the coyote gets paid for bringing them there. So these people are putting themselves at extreme risk, even if they manage to get into the country, which is already a big issue. So I know that life in Honduras is probably hell, but they haven't experienced hell until they're forced to work in a slave labor camp.
How did you get involved?
Okay, well, about 45 years ago, I had a friend who disappeared. A beautiful, tall, blonde German friend, Ursula. And they found her bicycle next to the road and no Ursula. And nobody has heard from her or seen her since. Several weeks later, we heard rumors that were probably true that she had been sold to a sultan in Libya. And that spooked me because 45 years ago, I was a pretty cute blonde myself. And I kept thinking, holy moly, that could have been me. And I started collecting stories. And finally, I had time to write a bunch of these stories down. And I have 3 books on Amazon about victims of this crime, one of which I'm pleased to say reached number 7 in all fiction on Amazon. It's called Harem Slave, and it's also been translated into French, Spanish, and German. And it's a story of a girl from Maryland who was visiting some friends in France and got kidnapped and found herself in the harem of an 81-year-old sheikh.
Have you actually met with a lot of these people that have gotten involved?
I've met with some. Most of them never get out. The ones who are shipped to the Persian Gulf, you'd never see them again. But I have talked to a number of people who were forced to be on the streets and then managed to get rescued or managed to escape one way or another. Oh yes, indeed. And the stories, they make you want to they break your heart.
In all this time, what has been your most significant career accomplishment?
My most significant career accomplishment? Oh, well, I think writing The Harem Slave has gotten the word out to more people than any other thing I have done. I have also had more than 700 radio and television interviews now in 30 countries, trying to educate the people that this is still a real problem that we shouldn't bury our heads in the sand about.
What is your worst professional experience that you'd rather not repeat?
I had some friends. This is when I lived in Cameroon. My husband was from Cameroon. And I had some friends who were murdered there. It looked like there was going to be a